husband locked his wife at home, and when the police arrived, they couldn't believe the reason why. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Hello, I would like to report something. There's a woman locked in a house with restraints on her hands, and the room has an electronic lock with a security system. The woman is asking me for help. Michael called the police and relayed this urgent message. He was deeply concerned about the woman, who barely spoke and could hardly open her eyes. Just a few hours earlier, Michael had been at his job, waiting to receive his next delivery order. He worked for a logistics company, and his upcoming delivery was quite unusual. It consisted of heavy-duty locks and a steel-reinforced door. Michael was alone at the warehouse, and since the order was bulky, he struggled to load everything into his pickup truck, but eventually managed. After driving for a short time, he arrived at the delivery location. It was a quaint, rural home, but Michael noticed that the entrance had accumulated mail. He knocked on the door several times, but no one answered. Determined not to return with the heavy load, Michael knocked again, harder this time. When the surroundings grew quieter, he heard faint murmurs but couldn't make out the words until someone clearly said, "Open the door." He hesitated, but then cautiously pushed it open. The door was unlocked, but the house seemed deserted. Michael called out to see if anyone was home. Suddenly, he heard a woman scream from upstairs. He hurried up and was shocked by what he saw. A young woman was restrained in a room with an electronic lock system, clearly in distress. "Are you okay? What happened?" Michael asked, but the woman, barely able to speak, showed signs of severe weakness, likely from not eating for days. Michael immediately called the police, who arrived quickly with several squad cars. When they freed the woman, the paramedics found her dehydrated and malnourished, surviving only on water for days. The woman was taken to the hospital, and Michael, though he had already given his statement, felt compelled to go along. At the hospital, Michael learned that the woman's name was Isabella and that she was married. However, her husband, Henry, was missing and was the main suspect in her situation. Isabella stayed in the hospital for several days. She could barely walk and spoke very little. The doctors believed her condition might be due to severe trauma from being locked up by her husband. Michael visited her a few times just to check on her, although she rarely responded. One day, Isabella spoke a little more, sharing that her husband had locked her in the house and then disappeared without a trace. Michael noticed that Isabella often broke into cold sweats, had a distant look in her eyes, and sometimes seemed to get angry out of nowhere. The doctors attributed these symptoms to the trauma she had endured. During one of his visits, Michael brought a bouquet of flowers, managing to get a faint smile from Isabella. He assured her that he had no intentions other than to make her happy during her stay in the hospital. They could be friends if she wished, but before Isabella could respond, a man entered the room. It was Henry, her husband. Oddly, Isabella seemed calm, but Henry was visibly anxious. "She can't stay here. It's dangerous for her," Henry said, his voice trembling. "I don't want to go back home and be locked up again," Isabella replied, her voice weak but firm. "It's for your own good. Your life is at risk if you stay free," Henry insisted. Hearing this, Michael discreetly called a nurse and asked her to notify the police, as the main suspect had just walked into the hospital. Within minutes, the police arrived and took Henry to the station for questioning. Michael stayed with Isabella, who was remarkably calm after her husband was taken away. She asked him to get a glass of water from the corridor. When Michael returned, Isabella was gone. He searched the room, then the hospital, but no one had seen her leave. His heart sank when he noticed that his wallet, left on the table, was missing, along with all the money inside. At the police station, Henry was being interrogated. Despite his nervousness, he insisted on seeing his wife immediately, but the officers wouldn't allow it. "Did you lock your wife in the room and prevent her from leaving?" one officer asked. "Yes, I locked her in her room, but I made sure she was fed," Henry replied, his voice breaking. "Why did you disappear and leave her without food?" Henry looked sorrowful, taking a moment before responding. "I didn't want to do it. I love her. I had an accident and couldn't get back home for those days, but I was worried about her the entire time. Everything I did was for Isabella's good because she..." Before he could finish, Henry fainted onto the table, leaving the officers scrambling to revive him. Meanwhile, Michael was frantically searching for Isabella. His phone buzzed with a notification from his bank. There had been a purchase at a nearby supermarket. He rushed there but found no sign of her. Determined, he continued his search, asking people on the street if they had seen a woman matching her description. An elderly woman told him she had seen the woman entering a dark alley in a dangerous part of town. Michael ventured into the alley and found Isabella talking to a tall, intimidating man. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Henry had regained consciousness, but his condition was dire. He pleaded with the officers, saying his wife was in danger if left unsupervised. "I'll tell you everything. You need to understand why I did what I did," Henry began, his voice weak. Years ago, Henry and Isabella had started dating. They were young and deeply in love, despite having little money. Henry worked tirelessly to ensure Isabella had everything she needed. Isabella, too, sought employment, but then they received unexpected news. Isabella was pregnant. They were thrilled, as they had always dreamed of becoming parents. Henry worked even harder after the news, managing to rent a larger house and buy a car. But the demands of his job meant he was rarely home, leaving Isabella feeling increasingly lonely. The day of their child's birth arrived, but it was fraught with complications. Isabella lost a lot of blood and needed a transfusion, but their baby was born healthy. After 4 days, they were able to bring their child home. However, Henry noticed a change in Isabella. She barely spent time with their child and seemed distant. Concerned, Henry urged her to see a psychologist, and after much persuasion, she was diagnosed with severe anxiety, triggered by the overwhelming responsibilities of motherhood and the traumatic childbirth. Over time, with treatment, Isabella began to show signs of improvement. A year passed, and while she had become more attached to their child, she still exhibited signs of distress. She couldn't understand why she felt this way, especially since she had always wanted to be a mother. Then, one fateful day, Isabella returned home exhausted after a trip to the supermarket. She had been running on little sleep and was completely drained. After bringing in the groceries, she took a bath and went to bed, forgetting that her child was still in the car. The next morning, she woke up in a panic, realizing her terrible mistake. She rushed to the car, but it was too late. The baby was unresponsive. Despite her desperate attempt to get help, the doctors couldn't save their child. The tragedy devastated both parents, but Isabella took it the hardest. She was consumed with guilt and could never forgive herself. The years that followed saw her spiraling into a deep depression. She barely ate, never smiled, and became a shadow of her former self. One day, Henry woke up to find Isabella missing. After searching the house, he found her in the garage, asleep in the car with the engine running and the doors sealed. Panicked, Henry rushed her to the hospital, where doctors saved her life. But instead of being grateful, Isabella was furious that he had intervened. Desperate, Henry sold the car, hoping to prevent another suicide attempt. But Isabella's behavior only grew more erratic. She began disappearing for hours, sometimes days, with no word of where she had been. Henry discovered that she had turned to drugs in a futile attempt to numb her pain. He tried everything to help her: counseling, rehab, medication, but nothing worked. In a last-ditch effort to protect her, Henry resorted to locking her in her room, installing an electronic lock system to keep her from leaving. He hoped that with time and care, she would return to the woman he had once known. But 2 months passed, and while Isabella began to show signs of improvement, Henry's health deteriorated rapidly. He became weak, suffered from constant dizziness, and started to faint regularly. Still, he refused to see a doctor, focusing all his energy on taking care of Isabella. One day, Henry had to travel to a nearby town to resolve some issues. During the trip, he collapsed in the sweltering heat and woke up 3 days later in a hospital. The doctors informed him that he had a severe heart condition and needed immediate treatment. But Henry's only concern was Isabella. He was terrified of what might have happened to her during the days he had been away. Desperate to return home, he left the hospital without being discharged and rushed back, only to find that Isabella had been taken to the hospital during his absence. When the officers heard Henry's story, they were skeptical, but some were moved by his genuine distress. They realized they needed to hear Isabella's side of the story to fully understand what had happened. Back in the dark alley, Michael watched as Isabella handed the tall man a small bag, likely filled with items she had bought using Michael's stolen card. Michael stayed hidden, unsure of how to approach her. After the man left, Isabella stood alone, staring at something small in her hand. Tears welled up in her eyes before she angrily threw the item away and collapsed to the ground, sobbing. Michael couldn't stay hidden any longer. He approached her cautiously, his heart breaking as he listened to her cries. Isabella confessed that she couldn't live this way any longer. She wanted to forget what had happened to her child, but the pain was too much to bear. She didn't want to depend on substances to numb her feelings anymore. Gently, Michael helped her to her feet and talked to her as they walked back to the hospital. When they arrived, the police were already waiting. They took Isabella to the station, where she was reunited with Henry. Seeing Henry in his frail state brought a wave of guilt crashing down on Isabella. Despite everything, she understood that he had only acted out of love, trying to protect her in the only way he knew how. She confirmed Henry's story to the police and refused to press charges against him. The situation was difficult for the officers, but without any further complaints, they released the couple. The next day, Isabella was discharged from the hospital, and Michael offered to drive her and Henry home. During the drive, Henry told Isabella that he had removed the electronic lock from her room and thrown away the keys. She was free, but he still feared that she might relapse or do something drastic. Isabella reassured Henry that she was ready to seek professional treatment and wouldn't try to escape as she had before. They found an excellent facility where Isabella could undergo long-term treatment. The only downside was that it would last up to a year, and Henry, due to his work and health, couldn't be with her. Isabella would be without a phone for most of the time, communicating only through letters. Despite these challenges, they decided it was the best option. As Isabella boarded the bus to the treatment center, Henry and Michael stood by, watching her leave. After everything they had been through, the two men had formed a close bond. "You're not going to tell her about your heart condition?" Michael asked. "No," Henry replied. "She's going through enough. I don't want to add to her worries. I'll start my treatment tomorrow, and with any luck, I'll be in better shape by the time she comes back." Isabella spent a long time at the treatment center, receiving comprehensive medical and psychological care to help her overcome her addiction and deal with the guilt over her child's death. It was a difficult journey, with many challenging days, but she kept pushing forward, knowing that Henry was counting on her to get better. She wrote him letters regularly, and Henry responded with words of love and encouragement. A year passed, and Isabella was finally ready to return home. The last few months had been particularly hard because Henry's letters had become less frequent and his handwriting had changed. Despite her concerns, his words reassured her, and she couldn't wait to see him again. When Isabella arrived home, she was surprised to find Michael there instead of Henry. Michael gently broke the news to her. Henry had been keeping a secret from her. He had been battling a serious heart condition for the past year. Isabella was devastated, but Michael assured her that Henry was alive and currently in the hospital receiving treatment. Together, they rushed to the hospital, and when Isabella saw Henry, tears streamed down her face. She stayed by his side, just as he had stayed by hers during her darkest times. Now, it was her turn to care for him. Henry's condition gradually improved, and he was eventually able to return home and continue his recovery. Isabella remained by his side, supporting him every step of the way. Despite the difficulties, Isabella had faith that her husband would make a full recovery. Her faith was rewarded when they received the news they had been praying for. A heart donor had been found for Henry. The couple was overjoyed, and after the successful surgery, Henry's health began to improve significantly. As Henry's health returned, the couple became inseparable, their bond stronger than ever after everything they had endured together. They were certain they would spend the rest of their lives side by side. 2 years later, Isabella and Henry were living some of the happiest days of their lives. They had financial stability, good health, and most importantly, they were deeply in love. But they both felt that something was missing. They wanted to have another child. They planned for it carefully, and one day, their dreams came true when Isabella found out she was pregnant. The couple was overjoyed, making plans for their baby's arrival, baby showers, gender reveals, and choosing godparents. During this time, They realized it had been a long time since they last heard from Michael. They wanted him to be the godfather of their child. After trying to contact him to no avail, they decided to visit his house in person. When they arrived, they were greeted by an elderly woman, Michael's mother. She sadly informed them that Michael had passed away in a car accident a few months ago. The couple was devastated, as they were deeply grateful for everything Michael had done for them. As they spoke with Michael's mother, Isabella noticed a recent photo of a baby on the wall. The woman explained that the baby was Michael's son, born earlier that year. The baby's mother had left Michael to raise the child alone and, even after his death, did not want to take responsibility for the child. Michael's sister, who lived in another country, already had 4 children and couldn't take in the baby either. His elderly mother couldn't care for herself without help, let alone a baby, so the child had been placed in an orphanage. When Isabella and Henry exchanged glances, they knew what each other was thinking. They were going to adopt Michael's son. Michael's mother was deeply moved and overjoyed that her grandson would have a loving home. Months passed, and Isabella held her newborn son in her arms while also caring for her newly adopted son. The couple smiled at each other, feeling a sense of peace and happiness they had never imagined possible. Life, they realized, was full of unexpected twists, but in the end, it had brought them the family they had always dreamed of. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.